Hello, I'm Evely and I will tell you one story. Let's go. It began on a morning like any other, though as the first light crept across the worn floorboards of his isolated apartment, Thomas awoke to a terror that slithered beneath his skin. Once a man of solid substance, firm in both body and resolve, he now found himself face to face with an inexplicable void. As he lay in bed, his eyes slowly adjusting to the dim, uncertain light, he became aware of a strange, almost electric sensation pulsing beneath the surface of his right hand. Curious and unnerved in equal measure, he reached out and pressed his fingers against his palm. To his mounting horror, nothing yielded. The skin remained intact, molded into the familiar contours of his hand, yet underneath lay only a hollow absence, as if the flesh itself had slowly dissolved into emptiness. The sensation was not confined solely to his hand. As he moved to the mirror, his gaze fell upon a reflection that was both his own and yet disturbingly alien. His eyes, once vibrant and alive, now seemed to hold an inexplicable void that mirrored the hollowness he felt within. The dim reflection flickered as though caught between moments, as if his very essence was in a state of perpetual transition, a man who had become empty, his physical presence reduced to a fragile facade. Every breath he took carried a chill of dread, and every heartbeat echoed like a death knell in the silence of that grim morning. Thomas's mind reeled with questions he dared not voice. What monstrous force had invaded him? Had he become the subject of a cursed alchemy, a victim of inexplicable metamorphosis? As he stepped away from the mirror, his hands trembled uncontrollably, and he noticed that the sensation of emptiness had begun to seep slowly into his other limbs. His body, once a reliable vessel, now felt like a shell, its inner workings as empty as a forgotten well. With every cautious movement, a faint sound accompanied him, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper of skin against air, as though the remnants of his former self were trying desperately to speak a warning. In the oppressive silence of his apartment, the world outside seemed to conspire with his inner decay. Shadows shifted in the corners, contorting into grotesque shapes that vanished when confronted directly. The familiar creaks of the old building became sinister harbingers of further loss, each sound echoing as though mocking his futile attempts to cling to his remaining humanity. Thomas tried to recall the events of previous nights, small, inexplicable glitches in reality, murmurs in the dark, fleeting images of figures lurking at the periphery of his vision. Now, confronted with the unmistakable evidence of his own undoing, every unease crystallized into a stark, undeniable terror. Unable to bear the isolation of his crumbling sanity, he ventured out into the bitter morning air. The streets, usually teeming with indifferent life, appeared shrouded in an otherworldly haze. Even the wind, which once carried the mundane scent of city life, now whispered of decay and forgotten promises. As he walked, his thoughts spiraled into feverish fragments of memory and nightmare. The empty sensation in his hands seemed to extend like tendrils into the very fabric of his being, making him question if he was still in control or if he had become nothing more than a vessel for an insidious force. At a deserted bus stop beneath a flickering street lamp, Thomas felt the first unmistakable tremor of something moving inside him. It was as though the void within was not static at all but alive, a hungry, shifting presence that pulsed in time with his racing heartbeat. The emptiness was not mere absence, it was a presence of its own, a sinister entity that had been lurking beneath the surface, waiting for the moment to emerge. In that moment of eerie stillness, he heard it, a soft, disjointed murmur that resonated from deep within the recesses of his mind, a sound that was both his own and not his own. As the morning gave way to a gloomy afternoon, Thomas found himself drawn inexorably toward an abandoned building on the outskirts of the city, a place rumored to harbor secrets of inexplicable phenomena. Its cracked windows and rusted doors beckoned him with a promise of answers or perhaps a final confrontation with the horror that was unraveling his identity. Every step toward that decaying edifice was laden with dread. The urban decay around him seemed to mirror the dissolution of his self. The further he walked, the more palpable the tension grew until he could almost taste the metallic tang of fear in the cool air. Inside the building, in a cavernous room filled with shattered remnants of forgotten lives, Thomas's empty hand brushed against something soft and pulsing on a dusty table. It was a scrap of paper, yellowed with age, scrawled with cryptic symbols and words that made his blood run cold. He could not read them, yet they seemed to whisper secrets about the nature of emptiness, the fragility of identity, and the terrible price of secrets best left unspoken. With his heart pounding in his ears, Thomas clutched the paper, feeling for the first time that perhaps the inexplicable emptiness was not the end, but the beginning of something far darker. A descent into a realm where the boundaries of the self and the void blurred into a single, horrifying continuum. And as a cold, unseen hand seemed to graze his shoulder from behind, Thomas's mind filled with a singular, dreadful realization he was not alone in his emptiness. Something else, an echo, a remnant of a long-forgotten curse, had awakened, and it was hungry. The terror of that unknown presence crept into every fiber of his being, leaving him stranded on the precipice of a nightmare from which there might be no return. Thomas's heart pounded as he stumbled back into the labyrinthine corridors of the abandoned building, the cold paper clutched tightly in his trembling hand. The cryptic symbols burned into his memory like malignant tattoos, each stroke a whisper of an ancient curse. The unseen force that had grazed his shoulder now pulsed inside him, a dark metronome counting down to an unknown reckoning. Shadows danced along the peeling walls, their movements both random and deliberate as though animated by an intelligence born of void and despair. Every step seemed to echo with an ominous cadence. The building, once a silent relic of urban decay, had transformed into a sentient maze of horror. Corridors elongated into impossibilities and doorways appeared where none had existed before. As Thomas ventured deeper, the sensation of emptiness began to intensify, no longer confined to his hand, it now radiated through his entire being, leaving him with an unnerving disconnection from his own flesh. The familiar rhythm of his heartbeat had grown erratic, as if in sync with a hidden, malevolent pulse. In a narrow, dimly lit room, the source of the paper's mystery finally revealed itself. At the far end of the chamber, an antique mirror, its surface marred by years of neglect, beckoned him with a hypnotic gleam. Drawn inexorably toward it, Thomas approached, only to see that his reflection was not alone. Behind him, in the mirror's peripheral vision, flickered shapes that defied logic, amorphous figures that seemed to reach out with spectral limbs, their intentions obscured by shifting shadows. When he spun around, the figures evaporated, leaving only the echo of a whispered name that chilled him to the core. The mirror's glass was like a portal to another realm. As he stared into it, the surface began to ripple as if disturbed by an unseen hand. Within those ripples, he saw fragments of a past life, a life filled with forgotten joys and tender memories now consumed by an overwhelming emptiness. But there was more, glimpses of an ancient ritual, cryptic incantations in a language lost to time, and the image of a gaunt figure, its eyes hollow yet brimming with a terrifying knowledge. The reflection seemed to communicate directly with him, offering silent promises of release from the anguish of his transformation. Yet each promise was steeped in the unmistakable taste of damnation. A sudden jarring noise, a cacophony of creaks, whispers, and the scraping of metal shattered the trance. Thomas whirled around to find the room morphing before his eyes. The walls pulsated as if breathing, and the floor beneath him seemed to ripple like disturbed water. In a moment of dreadful clarity, he understood that the emptiness was not merely a loss, it was a portal, a threshold between his crumbling human self and a deeper, unfathomable abyss. The air thickened with the scent of decay and the electric tang of imminent doom. Unable to escape the oppressive pull of the unseen force, Thomas sank to his knees. In the silence that followed, the building itself seemed to sigh, a long, mournful sound echoing with centuries of despair. Then, as if in answer to his silent plea, the very fabric of reality began to tear. A jagged rift appeared in the center of the room, an opening in space that revealed swirling darkness and eerie, otherworldly lights. From this rift emerged a procession of shadowed figures, their forms shifting and dissolving in a spectral dance. They moved with a purpose, guided by a force as old and relentless as time itself. One of the figures detached from the group and glided toward Thomas. Its eyes, or what passed for eyes, glimmered with a cold, indifferent intelligence. In that silent encounter, Thomas felt a searing intrusion into his mind, a torrent of voices, memories, and ancient secrets that he could not comprehend. The figure's presence merged with the void inside him, and suddenly his sense of self splintered. He was no longer certain if he was the one who had been transformed, or if the transformation had been his, like a slow poisoning that seeped into his soul. In the ensuing moments, time unraveled into a cascade of impossible visions. Thomas saw himself drifting in a desolate landscape where the sky bled twilight and the ground was littered with remnants of forgotten dreams. Ghostly echoes of laughter and weeping filled the air, and everywhere, the void beckoned with a magnetic pull that promised oblivion. The sensation of emptiness swelled to encompass not just his body, but the very essence of his being, leaving him adrift in a sea of despair. As the rift pulsed and the shadowed figures circled him, Thomas realized that the force within him was not a curse to be eradicated. It was an inheritance. The void, with all its enigmatic terror, was part of an ancient design, a cycle of decay and rebirth that linked him to a long lineage of tormented souls. The revelation was as paralyzing as it was profound. And in that moment, the boundaries between man and nothingness blurred irreversibly. With a final, desperate clarity, Thomas reached out to the figure that had merged with his consciousness. In that touch, he felt a torrent of alien emotions: sorrow, rage, and a horrifying liberation that shattered the last vestiges of his human resistance. The shadows closed in, enveloping him in their chilling embrace. As the rift widened, promising a plunge into a realm where even the faintest echo of humanity would be lost forever. In that final instant, as the building's walls crumbled into darkness and the spectral chorus rose to a deafening crescendo, Thomas understood the terrifying truth. The emptiness within was not the end of his existence, but the birth of a new, monstrous self. A self that belonged to the void, destined to haunt the interstices of reality for eternity. And so, as the last vestiges of light faded into oblivion, the man who had once been Thomas surrendered completely to the abyss, his very soul now a silent testament to the unimaginable horror that lay in wait beyond the fragile veil of human understanding. Thank you very much, and see you all in the next video.